Mark Rogers TV with my take and prediction on the national championship game. Number one, Alabama undefeated, taking on one-loss Clemson. Number two in the country, of course. It's the rematch of a 45-40 win for Bama, scoring 24 points in the fourth quarter with the help of the onside kick and the kick return from Kenyon Drake. All right, let's first look at the seasons for these two football teams. Alabama, in regards to last season, dominated much more here in 2016. The Crimson Tide has not been challenged since a Week 3 game at Oxford against Ole Miss. When the pass defense led up, they turned the ball over, and it was 48-43 with Ole Miss making a late comeback. Since then, Bama has been dominant. The playoff game, despite the lack of explosion against Washington, very similar to the game against Michigan State last year. In that game against Sparty, Bama was held down in the first half offensively. Their defense dominated. Both defenses dominated. It was basically a scoreless first half for most of the first half. Bama broke out to a 10-0 lead, intercepted Connor Cook near the end zone, and that was the end of the game. They ran Sparty out of the building 38-0 in the second half. Against Washington, clearly the better team for Alabama, but it took a pick six at the end of the first half, or otherwise it would have been a bit sketchy at 10-7 going in at halftime. Alabama's defense won it. The offense did not look spectacular by any stretch, but it was that type of game for Alabama. They didn't need offensive explosion. They needed to maintain the football and the lead, and they did that with Bo Scarborough. All right, looking at Clemson's season, many have talked in the national media about the Tigers being so much more dominant and impressive in 2015. But if you look back, they narrowly escaped on the last play of the game against Notre Dame. The Louisville game was extremely close, and they were challenged deep into the fourth quarter against the likes of North Carolina in the ACC championship game, South Carolina, Florida State, and even NC State. This year, of course, they had the gift from above against NC State, or otherwise Clemson would not be playing in this game if NC State hits that field goal. Clemson did nothing to win that game at the end in regards to blocking the field goal or making a play. That was a gift. Of course, they lost to Pitt 43-42. They had a scare against Troy and to a certain extent against Virginia Tech, although they generally scored 1 to 2 touchdowns ahead of Virginia Tech in the ACC championship game. All right, 45-40 last year. Deshaun Watson, of course, with a brilliant game, aside from a late first-half interception to Eddie Jackson, 478 total yards, 405 through the air. Of course, Clemson couldn't run it very well against Bama. Wayne Gallman's back for another crack at the Crimson Tide after having less of a season in 2016 than 2015. Interesting to note that Clemson outgained Alabama last year 550 yards. When does Bama give up 550 yards when Johnny Manziel's not on the field? 550 to 473 Clemson. The Tigers also racked up 31 first downs against Alabama. The Tide had 18, with Jake Coker only hitting for 16 completions, but for 335, the big plays, of course, to O.J. Howard. There was no Mike Williams in that game for Clemson. So he's the guy that can blow the top off the defense. Clemson's wide receiver core is the best in college football, the deepest in college football. Such was the case even last year, the deepest in college football, but they didn't have the one guy to blow the top off the defense in Mike Williams. He's back, and he's playing extremely well. Special teams obviously proved to be the difference. Nick Saban went for the onside kick. It was perfectly executed. That turned the game around in the fourth quarter. Kenyon Drake as well with a kick return for the touchdown. This season, Ardarius Stewart has been the main kickoff return guy for Alabama, as a number of guys have shared the duties in special teams. Ardarius Stewart, though, returning kicks against Washington in the semifinal game. Trevon Diggs returning the one punt in the national semifinal game. Neither of these guys have a history of breaking long touchdown runs. Clemson, the metrics pointed to a deficiency in special teams last year, and we saw it play out in the national championship game. What we have seen this year is Clemson tighten things up on special teams, have been much better in that phase of the game. Ohio State almost broke a couple down the middle. Paris Campbell, not a dynamic kick returner, broke free, got through the middle. So Clemson has probably addressed that concern, I would think. All right. If we run down the positional units, what do we have? At quarterback, Clemson with a decided advantage, Deshaun Watson against Jalen Hurts. Although Watson has thrown 17 interceptions, 2 against Ohio State that did not cost him. One was a poorly thrown ball. The other one, Malik Hooker just made an exceptional play running to the corner of the end zone. So Clemson with a decided advantage, but Watson, of course, has to shoulder more of the load. He's not going to be able to rely on a running game. I cannot see in any way how Clemson's going to be able to run the ball against Alabama. I was surprised to look back at last year's stats and see that they ran for about 145 yards, but of course, that was Deshaun Watson for 73. That was Wayne Gallman, 14 carries for 45 yards. Bama's defense is even better this year. Again, since the Ole Miss game, and nobody's challenged them. And I know that people think that the SEC is down, and it is offensively in particular, especially at the top. A lot of really good teams, but no, aside from Alabama, top 5 or top 10 teams, it would appear. But Bama locked everybody down start to finish. At running back, Alabama would have a slight advantage, I believe. Decidedly, but not excessive advantage there. The offensive line goes Alabama's way. At wide receiver, I think Alabama's just as talented, but because of the limitations at quarterback and because of the depth at wide receiver that Clemson has, I give the Tigers a slight advantage, with Mike Williams being a huge difference from last year. Defensive line, linebackers, secondary, across the board, Alabama's better. The smallest advantage defensively that Alabama would have would be defensive front, the front defensive line against Clemson. We saw what the Tigers accomplished against a deficient Ohio State offense, but it's still top talent at Ohio State, some of the best talent in the country, and Clemson completely shut them down and confused the Buckeyes on offense. So the defensive lines are elite. These are two of the best, along with LSU, Auburn, Ohio State, and a few others across the country. At linebacker, I think Alabama's got a decided advantage, and definitely in the secondary. Bama's got by far the better secondary. And special teams, we still give the edge to Alabama. All right, Nick Saban, Dabo Swinney. Dabo Swinney's done a tremendous job with Clemson. I think they've got the right mindset. We will be, again, hunting Alabama. They are the hunter and not the huntee. Alabama used to this number 1 position and used to fending off all challenges. All right. I got them all right for the college football playoff this season. If you heard me back in August, I said it was going to be Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, and Washington. I looked back at my records, and I have predicted the national championship games correct going back to 2007. All right. Alabama, one of the great defenses that we've seen in recent college football history. The best player on the field, at least with the ball in his hands. I don't know if it's going to project to the NFL draft in terms of sheer talent, but in terms of a playmaker, a guy that's going to have the ball in his hands, of course, the best player on the field is Deshaun Watson. That is the one issue I've had in dealing with this game, is Jalen Hurts versus Deshaun Watson, and what I saw out of Hurts in the semifinal game. But I think the game played that way. I think Jalen Hurts will make some plays against this Clemson defense. I think Deshaun Watson, being one-dimensional because they're not going to be able to run it from the traditional running back position, I just can't take one guy against a team. The rosters are similar, but Alabama's just a grade above everyone else. They're a grade above Ohio State and Florida State and Clemson. They have shown that time and time again, that there's an elite in college football, and right now there's Alabama. So I'm going to take the entirety of the team, and especially that great Alabama defense to get it done. Final score, Alabama 30 and Clemson 23. Enjoy the national championship game, and we'll talk it up right here on Mark Rogers TV.